With that, my introduction. My name is Joshua Losgar. I go by JScar when we're talking about the Linux side of the house. I have a couple other handles with other communities on the InfoSec side. You can take a look at my GitHub where all this information is going to be hosted. I'm a senior technical account manager at Red Hat. That means I get to help people plan the products that they're trying to implement and tell them about the future problems that they may be having to help craft a solution for them. I'm also a hacker. I'm a podcaster. I'm a maker, 3D printer, hardware geek, love hardware, software. I've got a few Raspberry Pis, like 46 and counting, but hey, it's a small collection, it's fine. I'm also a husband and a father of 3 boys. They're watching and streaming at home, and I have a very loving and supporting wife that lets me buy a lot of toys, so it's been fun. So I've bought some so you don't have to. So how did I get here? I started off not as a Linux native. I did 14 years as a countertop and cabinet maker with a family-owned business. And the thing that ended up helping me move into computers was the 2008 recession. I was always interested in Linux. I was always playing with it, but it was never a full-time gig. And I went through, studied for the A+, I studied for the LPIC, but there just wasn't any jobs because I was so junior at the time. So during that time frame, I also helped start a hackerspace and then started joining a Linux user group. And from those Linux user groups, I was able to make connections that ended up helping me land the job later on. So creating that content, getting familiar with Linux, this is all going to help you with your networking to make sure that you're getting those connections. And then that call to action, yeah, when you have a wife and you have a kid and there's no money coming in, yeah, you got to make the change. So if I can go through and do it, coming from routing countertops to talking about routings on networks and other things, from router to router, if I can do it, you guys can too. So I thought, hey, my first Linux job is going to be fantastic. It's going to be easy walking in. I'm just going to be working with hardware, and I'm going to not working with any customers. It's going to be great, just Linux bliss, right? I was in for a shocker. Walked in with no documentation, no network diagrams, no configurations of any of the machines across the entire labs, no consistency within those machines and the entire lab, and we had no internet connection. I was working in a truly disconnected network. So that was fun. You get to go to a terminal, do the research that you needed to, sneakernet things over across. Lots of fun, lots of time learning there and finding out, hey, that not everything works without the internet, and you have to self-host. So that was a lot of fun. So from the first Linux experience for the first job there, I've found these steps to success. And if you use these same applications for your first job and in your home lab, you're going to set yourself up for success. So first off is you need to document your process. It doesn't matter if you're going to just do a screen cap, if you're going to go through and write it down manually. Do yourself and your future self a favor by documenting that process. Create a network map. So many of us want to make this awesome thing, but have no plan of how we're going to lay it out. So if you make the time to document it ahead of where you've arrived, it's going to change. That's okay. But start with the mapping of it. There's a cool tool called draw.io that you can go through and use online. It's like Visio, but it's not costing you a lot of money. While it's not free and open source, it is free to use online, so it's a good trade-off. You can install it via Flatpak as well, so I have that installed as part of my very first things that I install on a brand new machine. Version control your documentation. This should be a given if you've been in the Linux industry for a while, but if you're just starting, do something even just as basic as a Google document, because those have version histories that you can go back and see what has changed, who has changed it. Later on, you can work your way up to using Git, checking something into Git, checking something out of Git. But get started with just time date stamp and or putting it in something that tracks your time. Later on, we can start looking at automating our steps. If we're saying, here's how to go click the GUI X, Y, and Z, there are lots of different ways to be able to automate your process, whether it's bash scripts, whether it's going through and using Puppet, whether it's going through and using Ansible. Again, there's more tools and more ways to do things in Linux than one, so you'll find out which one works best for you. Utilize your resources. If you're a student and you're trying to get your home lab up and running, you can go through and usually get access to a bunch of different training programs. You got Udemy, you've got access to like Cloud Academy was something that helped me get started up and running. their content is legitimate. I like it. It does cost a little bit of money if you have the spare time, or if you can do their 7-day trial, it's well worth it. Or pay for it one time at a month, go after one cert and pay for it for that 1 month. Totally, totally worth it. And share what you're working on. So many of us have projects that we're working on, but we never tell anybody about it, or the documentation is not good enough. I'm going to ask you to change your thought process there, because you need to share it, because otherwise it'll never be done. And somebody else may be having that same issue on the internet, and if you can say, hey, here's my stopping point, or where I had an issue, there might be somebody else says, oh, I was able to make 2 more steps further down that line, or did you try X? So share what you're doing, friends, family, online, and then 2 bonus steps for successes would be logging all the things. When it comes to troubleshooting, if you've got logs, you can have a direction to go. If you're not logging, you're going to have an issue, because you need to collect those to find out and troubleshoot. And the big one for me, go from reactive IT to proactive. How many folks have gone through and read the Phoenix Project book? We got a good handful of folks. Fantastic. Since you're here at Scale, you also have the opportunity to go to the DevSecOps track. I would highly suggest it. If you go through and you buy the Phoenix Project book, it tells about 95% of the way most industry is run when it comes to IT. And we've been there, we felt the pain, but if you're just getting into the industry, instead of you experiencing that, read the book instead and avoid the problems that are coming. There's a couple other follow-up books as well that's worth their weight in gold. There's the DevOps Handbook, and then there is the Unicorn Project. While the Phoenix Project focuses on the ops side of the house, the Unicorn Project focuses on programming, or the development side of the house. Okay, with that quick introduction, currently, who has a home lab? All right, we got about a dozen people or so. Awesome. So who's here because they want to build a home lab? 1, 2, 3, about a dozen as well. Awesome. Okay. So there are lots of ways to build home labs. There's also different costs in building home labs. I'm going to start with the software, and we're going to touch lightly on the hardware and then resources to get deeper into both afterwards. So I'm going to start with why I'm going through and suggesting that you start with RHEL. And this is me as an individual here, not as a Red Hat employee. The reason why I went through and did it in my lab is because I get the same subscription access to this software repositories for what I'm supporting. I used to work with the Navy, and everything was offline, so I had to get documentation. I had to bring over these repositories into our network. So this was important to make sure I had a bit-for-bit exact copy of what I needed to go through and do. The security patches were a big deal because we had a patch window that was fairly robust. We needed to turn that around. If the government is going through and doing that, and depending on your patch cycle for your organization, patch cycles come out often. Grab it, bring it across. You have access to the customer portal. The big deal on this one is that there are over 10,000 articles to help you troubleshoot your problems. Not a lot of people know this. I didn't know it until I was a Red Hat employee, and I wish I would have known this sooner, to where you can literally jump on, say, here's an HP box, or here's the error that I'm having, and there is almost guaranteed a solution or a problem statement there as well. My job as a TAM, if somebody comes up with one of those problem statements and there's not a knowledge article basis for it, we have to go through and help write it. So we're trying to help grow that out, and you're not the only one who's come across this issue. Take a look at the knowledge base there. Access to Red Hat Insights. This is something that we've gone through, that if you have a developer license, if you have a subscription, you can go through and get more insight into your machine. It is an opt-in process, but we've got different scanning features. We've got different features to be able to go through and turn on compliance, to be able to see when your patch windows and drift is. So these are all things that you get one pane of glass. That's a whole nother talk, but it is an awesome addition to just getting that Red Hat subscription. And importantly, because of my background working with the DoD, working on hardening guides. Because we had to go to certain compliance needs, we had to make sure we could download those, apply them as necessary, and then get that report back by saying, okay, this is locked down to PCI compliance or stigging something. So depending on which organization that you're working with and your compliance needs. That's why I chose to use Red Hat in my home environment. So with that, to get started, where you want to start is getting that free 16 developer licenses. We've had this for a few years. It used to only be one license, but it's 16. You can do physical boxes, you can do online boxes, you can do virtual machines, you name it. And that's unique per email. So in our use case, when we, as Red Hat, introduced this, we asked, and we're telling folks, if you want to use this for your home lab, that's perfect. If you want to use it for your church, that's perfect. Just use an email per that device. So that's how you can go through and get started. So QR code is there. The link is at the bottom as well. There is a huge amount of FAQs along with this. I'm happy to help answer any questions when it comes to that. Otherwise, do take a look at the FAQs because they answer a lot. And it's constantly growing. So once you land on that one site, you're going to then go to Red Hat's site to sign up for an account. Doesn't cost you anything. And you sign up with an email. And it's going to have you fill out a form. What's your name? What's your address? What's a phone number? This is going to be set up for you as an individual. I have never gotten a call from Red Hat on my personal side, even including for slides for our hackerspace. For this setup today, I went through this exact same process yesterday to make sure all my slides are current and accurate. So this should be accurate as of, what is this, Saturday 11th of 2023. Things may change in the future, but this is what it looks like. Once you've gone through and sent that off, there's the submit button. You're going to have to go through and verify your email to make sure it's not just a bot sending that in. So you go to the next step, you click the link to verify that it was you. In this case, I was using Proton Mail. And then at that point, you're now ready to finish setting up your profile. You have two options here. It's kind of hard to see, but the top one says a corporate account. The second one says personal account. If you're going through and using a RHEL 16 developer license, the one that's for free, you want to go through and pick that personal one on the bottom. If you are part of your organization is trying to set up an account to hook to your larger company, that's when you would go through and do the top one, which is the corporate account. So you fill in a couple more pieces of information here. So email, mailing address, phone number, and you're off and running to the races. Now, we don't necessarily have a EULA. We have something that's called an OSA, which is the Open Source Assurance Agreement. Like we should all be going through and doing with EULAs or anything else, read through it so you understand what you can go through and do with this license, but it's fairly open. I haven't had an issue with anything that I'm doing with it yet, and neither has the business unit who's helped put this out there to everybody. So after you've signed up, you've agreed, the next step is now you are logged into the portal. This is the first thing that you're going to go through and see. You're going to then go to the top left-hand side where the downloads button are. And while you have access to all of our repositories, all of our different software that we have, we're going to specifically go download and install Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Once you click on that, you do have a drop-down menu to choose whatever option that you want here. You can click on this one, and it goes from 9.1, 8, 7, 6. You can find everything on there. I'm going to be focusing on RHEL 9.1 today because of the benefits of it, which we're going to cover a little bit here in the future. So we're going to download the ISO image, which is fairly large. It's about 8 gigs for RHEL 9.1. If you're going to install RHEL 8, you're going to need a larger thumb drive because that's like 11.2 gig currently. So you want to run with like a 16 gigabyte thumb drive. If you got a USB 3.0, it's going to install faster. So we'll talk about some of these other things that you can download later on, but we're going to focus on the ISO for right now. After you've gone through and downloaded the ISO, and it's fairly quick depending on your internet connection, the next step is going to go confirm your subscription status. So that's in this top left-hand corner underneath subscription. What you're going to make sure that is checked is this the simple content access. If you do not go through and check this box now, when you get ready to register your RHEL license, it's going to say, hey, you don't have an account. What's going on? By going through and checking this box, it says, I'm going to accept whoever's this username and this password to make sure they can attach to your account. So key point here, you'll have issues if you don't click that button. This is also where you can go through and look at your other subscriptions, saying how many devices you've got connected to your account. Since I just set this one up for this purpose yesterday, I've only got a single box connected to it. All right. Now pivoting, now that we've got the ISO on our machine that we've downloaded it to, we need to be able to pick some type of software to what's called burning the ISO image to a thumb drive. You're creating a bootable Linux drive. There are a whole bunch of different options when it comes to using software to burn to a thumb drive. The one I'm going to suggest today is, because it's easy, it's called Etcher. It will run on Mac, it will run on Linux, it will run on Windows. They've even got a Flatpak, right? So it's out there for everybody, and it's the same step process for each one of these. Like I said, there are a lot of different ones. I would just go with Etcher for basicness sake. The cool thing is, that's the entire program. It's just got these 3 selections. So you're going to go through and select your thumb drive. So it's not going to automatically choose your hard drive, your NVMe drive that's built in. It's got a little bit of smarts there to make sure there's a thumb drive and it's going to connect to that one, versus some of the other flashing programs that are out there may just select whatever, and you need to make sure you're not going to overwrite your OS. So that's one of the benefits of using Etcher. After you've gone through and selected your thumb drive, you've obviously plugged it into your machine, then the second option is for you to click and upload your ISO. So in this case, we had both RHEL 8.7 and RHEL 9. I ended up choosing the RHEL 9 image. And then from there it says, hey, select the thumb drive that you want to install this to. As it shows right now, there's just the one thumb drive plugged in, and then it says view hidden. The view hidden is my NVMe drive, so it's like I said, out of sight, out of mind. It's not going to install to your boot drive. After you've installed your thumb drive, you've selected it, you click that big old blue flash button. And depending on the speed of your USB, or whatever you're writing this to, this can take a few minutes. The countdown window is pretty accurate from Etcher, so this one took about 3 minutes to burn it on there. And then Etcher does the next step as well by verifying that the image is working correctly, that it's a whole image. If you start working with ISOs, sometimes you can have issues with it not downloading correctly. I'm going to say that's out of scope for right now, but there is something also called an MD5 or a SHA-1 hash you can check for if you have download issues. But it burns it to the drive. It'll go through and say, flash complete. All right, do you want to burn another one, or are you good to go? In this case, we're just going to close the program, and we're good to move on to our next step. And in this case, you're just going to literally install the thumb drive into your machine. I'm using an Intel NUC for this one, just because it is a nice small form factor. We'll talk about more hardware later on. But in this case, I personally find going through and getting a labeler and saying what key is your boot drive, because if you go to different brands, everybody's got their own boot key. So the little labels really help with, oh, I'm working with the NUC today, it's F10. Oh, it's the Dell, it's the F4, just print the label, it'll save you time. So when it comes to hardware, there are so many different BIOSes out there, let alone different motherboard manufacturers. There's going to be specific things that you need to turn on to make sure you can go run Linux, you can go through and run your virtual machines underneath it. So I say start blank, start new, so you know exactly what the status is of your hardware. I like to reset the BIOS, so I know exactly what I'm turning on or turning off. I want to make sure that enabling the USB boot. I want to make sure that underneath the performance or processor, we've got a couple settings set up, including hyper-threading is enabled. There's an asterisk here. If you're working in a more secure environment and you don't want to have hyper-threading turned on because of the Meltdown and Spectre attacks, you probably want to make sure that's turned off. So you're going to lose some performance there because it's virtually slicing up your CPU, but there are benefits to this as well. So hyper-threading is one, depending on your situation. Number two is virtualization technology. You want to make sure that's enabled, because if you try to go install KVM or the other software and all of a sudden it's not coming up, it's most likely because your BIOS wasn't turned on for virtualization technology. Intel has their own brand of the Intel virtualization, IVT or AMD has their own as well, so just look for that virtualization technology in the name, depending on which architecture that you're running. From there, underneath the security and boot settings, this may be unpopular. This may have some spiciness to it. But again, trying to say, we're starting basic and we're working our way up. Go with secure boot disabled. I don't know how old or how new of hardware that you're running, and this is something that you can learn how to use later on. Same thing with a UEFI boot. I have had issues with different hardware to where if these are enabled, you can have a hard time ever getting Linux installed. So start with the disabled, learn more, and evolve. Do turn on the legacy boot, because that's going to make sure that Linux will be able to be installed onto the box. So while I didn't have an issue with my framework laptop when it came to the Intel NUC, flashing the BIOS, wiping it, if I didn't go through and turn these off, it wouldn't come up. So your mileage is going to vary, but this has been a good rule of thumb for me to get started. Okay. And so once you've plugged in the thumb drive, you've selected the ability for you to boot to that thumb drive, this is the initial installation of RHEL. If you've never done this before, it's pretty straightforward. I go through and I like to set my root password first. Something new with RHEL 9 is that you can't log in as root by default. That is a change from RHEL 8. I'm going to keep the default settings because that's a good security practice to make sure that's disabled. I then immediately set up another user to get into the box. So in this case, I do LabBot because, hey, it's just the backup account. I do make sure that it's an admin account, and then I set the password for this as well. After that's done, the next step that I like to go through is set up my time zone. We're here in California. I live in California, so hey, it's set it what makes sense for you. Now, here's the fun part. When it comes to setting up LVM for the very first time, everybody's got their opinion on it. This is mine. Wipe the drive that you're going through and working with. Make sure to check that box to delete all the small parts. Select the ability to automatically create LVM, and then delete the /home. Because if you're going to set this up as a virtualization box, you want to put all of the space you possibly can to the slash or /var/lib. That's too complicated. Just make sure you put all the extra space you can to that root partition. It's going to save you headaches later on. You can learn more about it later as well by partitioning it as necessary. This is my setup. There's also lots of debate on swap. Don't worry about it. Just go with I'm rounding up the number. I've got 32 gigs of RAM in this box. It's using 16 gigs of swap. Go ahead and just click on and go forward from there. Lots of debate. I'm happy to talk with you all more about the pros and cons of that. I also then go through and set my host name here in the bottom. I like to treat my devices as cattle, not as pets. So I went through and got a bunch of bird names, and then I did bird name 1, bird name 2, bird name 3. So depending on their use case, that's the setup. From there, you're ready to install. I went with the default GUI. You can go through and go super special on all the packages that you want to install. I didn't even go into that because it's too complicated. Go with the basic. From there, you can get installed. The install takes about 8 minutes when I was using a USB thumb drive, 3.0 thumb drive, to the Intel NUC. Your hardware is going to make a difference on how fast or how slow this installs. If you're installing on spinning disk, the old rusty hard drives, it's going to be slower. If you've got an NVMe drive, this thing's going to be screaming fast. So instead of watching the bar load and just talking, at this point, are there any questions that folks have? There will be time for more questions as well, but I thought I'd start here. Yes? Yes? You've had an issue with RHEL 8. Okay, what's the issue? Yep. That is a very valid point. Okay. So the question was, in RHEL 8, there was an issue when you install a VM, it doesn't come with the VM enabled by default for networking. That was true in 8. I have not had that issue in 9 thus far. There's also another side step that we can talk with as well. Part of the reasoning behind that is that depending on the environment that you're installing, you may not want network installed to start with. As part of the usual setup that I would go through and do for RHEL 8, and I've got this recorded, it's on my YouTube channel, because I do go through and make sure to enable that on boot time, so then thereafter it always comes up. I've not had that issue on RHEL 9 so far, so mileage may vary, would love to talk more on it. Absolutely. Any other questions? Yes? What's the default X or Wayland? So right now we do have both installed. We have Wayland installed and running by default. If you want to change that, you can go back to the login menu. There's a little gear icon and drop down to change to X instead. So for folks who are brand new to Linux on this, the X versus Wayland deal, super simplified, is that they've rewritten how the display is being done. And X has been standard for the very, very long time. It works with a lot of different programs. Some of the newer programs, some of the newer settings don't work as well in Wayland. So while we're trying to make the default looking towards the future, you absolutely have that ability to fall back. I know for a long time there we had issues with like screen sharing on Wayland. Things have gotten a lot better now. So with my job usually going through and needing to present to folks, having to switch back and forth, just no. We started filing more bug reports and saying, here's the issue that we had with X, or in this case, Wayland, not X, and then tried to make sure that we can match what X looks like. Hopefully that answered your question. Any other questions? All right then. So instead of continuing to watch the little bar load away, like I said, it takes about typically 8 minutes to go through and do so. There'll just be a little restart icon in this bottom corner where it says quit right now. We're going to skip the rest of that video. Doop, doop, doop. Maybe. Okay, cool. So after the install is done, it says, okay, do you want to reboot? And it's like, yes, let me reboot. And it'll pop back up here. This is the Intel Knock Again rebooting. So we should have a small loading screen here. Any second. There we go. It'll take just a minute for the first time. Fun fact, if you have a lot of RAM in your machine, the first time boot will take a little bit of time because it needs to verify that all of it's working and that it's checked in. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and log into our box. We can see that just the default is the lab bot. If you've never played with GNOME before, go through the setup. It's worthwhile. If you're running on a laptop, this thing is great when it comes to gestures. I'm a fan of GNOME. It's not for everybody, but Linux has so many options. Again, there's more than one way to do things in Linux. So the next thing was there was a pop-up menu saying, hey, do you want to go through and register this? So there's like 5 different ways to register Red Hat. You can pick any one of them. The simplest way was just clicking the little banner that came up. In this case, I went and had to go grab my username and password because that was on another box. So then this is the same email account and the same password that you set for setting up your RHEL developer license. So any second now, I should be going through and typing that in. Sweet. So once that's typed in and good to go, this is the most basic form for you to be able to register your Red Hat Enterprise Linux device up to our subscription service. And this is going to enable you to be able to now download and install different packages, because up to this point, if you try to say like yum update and download something, it's going to say I can't do that because there's no repositories. This subscribes you, says here's your default repositories, and you're good to go. There are other ways to register. Again, that's out of scope for this time, but you can get very complicated with it very quickly. So this takes about, I want to say 30 seconds or a minute for it to go through and register that information, and then it'll say, hey, great, you're now registered. What do you want to do from here? In this case, you can open up GNOME Software Manager and make sure to get your patches and updates. I went to the command line because it's faster. This is not for everybody, but it is a very simple command to go through and do. We're doing sudo to be able to elevate our privileges to an admin. We're using yum because that's our package manager, and we're saying update all the packages. The tac y, or the negative y, means yes, I accept and go ahead and install everything. Versus if you didn't have the tac y, it would then ask, are you sure you want to install this? So this was a RHEL 9.1 image that was disconnected from the network when I installed it yesterday. I plugged in the network, and now it's grabbing all of these packages and installing it. This takes about, for me yesterday, it took about 4 minutes for it to go through and download and install everything. And instead of watching all these patches, this is all good, this is all normal. I'm not getting any errors or warnings on this far side where it says upgrading and such. If you have an error or warning, then that would be an issue that we can look into. I see we have a couple questions. Go ahead first, and then, yeah. You're absolutely right. When I did tac y, I said, yes, I'm going to accept the keys, and yes, I'm going to accept all the software installs. If you're in that more secure environment, don't do the tac y. Make sure that you're verifying the keys. You're absolutely right. Yes? That is a fantastic question. So yum versus DNF, and for folks new to Linux, those are just different package managers. The fun part is, most of it is now, yum has been aliased to DNF. So it doesn't matter. You can use either one. You're going to get the exact same commands using both, and they're both aliased to the same thing. So to answer your question, either one works. So whatever you're going through and supporting up to this point in time. Some folks who've written scripts don't want to update yum to DNF because it's written, it's only 3 letters, but hey, my stuff works, so we aliased it. You betcha. Ooh, yep, don't hit that there. All right, any other questions so far? Nope? Okay. So, hey, perfect timing. We just finished our package install. Anytime I go through and install updates, I like to go through and do a reboot, because then you're flipping over, you're able to then use the newest kernel if there was an update there, and you're just back up and running, you have a fresh start. All right, moving on to our next one. Nope, I don't need to loop again. All right, so now that we've got Red Hat Enterprise Linux installed, we've got it registered, and we're updated with our packages, who has heard of the Cockpit project? All right, we've got about a dozen people, awesome. For those who don't know about Cockpit, it is an awesome web GUI interface for you to admin your Linux boxes. This is not just on RHEL. You can install it on a whole bunch of different Linux that are out there. In fact, I've got it running on my Steam Deck. So because I can, why not, right? If you missed the QR code there is the cockpitproject.org. So you can get this up and running on whatever Linux that you're running. There are instructions for each one, and including different versions for each one as well. If we're just focusing on Cockpit being installed on RHEL, we have it available all the way back to RHEL 7. The ones, if we're going to specifically focus on RHEL 9.1, is you're just going to go sudo yum install cockpit. And then I'm doing the extra step, making sure that you're actually enabling that, versus if you just install a piece of software, it doesn't mean that it's running. The systemctl means that I'm going to make sure this is a service that's running in the background. The enable argument there means that I want to start this, making sure that it is going to happen on reboot. But the tac now means start it right this very second, instead of waiting till a reboot. And then we're calling out what service that we're starting, which is the cockpit.socket. With that, it's up, it's running. Now, here's the awesome part. Depending on if you're going through and running this on a single box in front of you, you could just do localhost :9090, or you can connect to this thing on a remote box. So if you have a laptop and you want to connect to a headless system now, you can now unplug your monitor, you can now unplug your keyboard and mouse, and you can talk and manage this thing completely remotely, which is awesome. So for like my Intel NUC, it works great. I just need network and power plugged into it now. I don't need keyboard, monitor, and anything else. So localhost, if you're just using that same box, use your IP address :9090 if you're remoting in. You're going to use the same username and password as your box that you set up. So in this case, it would be like labbot in my example. And we had a question.
Assuming firewall B was enabled
Fantastic question. So the question was, what about this interacting with the firewall, and how does that work? With RHEL 7 and RHEL 8, you do need to go through and enable that. With RHEL 9, it's automatically, as soon as you install Cockpit, it will go through and make those firewall rules as well. So when it comes to whatever version that you want to install yours on, it's been documented really well by the community by saying, here are the steps for firewall if you're going out of regular ports or if you're using a special piece of software. So, excellent question. Okay, with that, this is your standard default overview when you first log in. I know it's a little bit small because there's lots of data on this screen. I want to start by calling out, in the top corner, it says limited access, and it's got a lock on there. And it's because you just logged in as a regular user right now. You've not logged in as an admin. If you want to elevate your privileges, you're going to click this big old blue button that says, take me to admin land. Once you've gone through, it'll pop up a little window by saying, okay, go ahead and type in that sudo password. And then now in the top corner, the lock is gone and it says administrative access. So now you are working on your machine as admin with sudo privileges. You're able to change everything about it that you want to. So our next step is to go over to the application side. There's a long list of different cool items that are here that could be like 3 or 4 other talks, but we're going to go click applications. And we're going to see that there are a bunch of other applications we can install into Cockpit. We're just going to focus on installing KVM and the virtualization side of the house for today. So you can see that with the 2 arrows here and here. We can click the install button. It takes about a minute for it to install. If you want to automate this, something for later, you could just do this in the command line with these 2 commands here at the bottom of the screen. The pro about this, with the YouTube video that I have, I show you how to do it all with the GUI, including turning on libvirtd service through Cockpit. If you're just doing it command line, that takes care of everything that you need to. You're up and running. Once we've got that installed, you could remove it, but the button changed from install to remove. We're ready to go on to our next step. Over on the side now, we've got another menu entry, which is now called Virtual Machines. We can then click on it. By default, there is nothing set up for your virtual machines. So you're going to need to create all of that from scratch. But it only takes you 2 minutes, which is awesome. First off, we need to start with where are we going to store these devices. You go through and do that by this top corner where it says storage, and you're going to make one new storage pool that's called default. All lowercase, default. You can go through and get very complicated very quickly with really cool setups. Don't overcomplicate it. If you're just here trying to start, keep it default, keep it lowercase, and you'll be good to go. Looks like I need to add something to the notes here. You need to add a path to this. So I'll make sure to add that before I upload these to YouTube and to the site. But it's going to be /var/lib/libvirt. That's where you want to make sure that you're pointing everything to. The awesome part about that is that there are different other pieces of software in Linux that also hook into virtualization. That's where everything lives. The permissions are set up correctly there, versus if you're trying to mount it someplace else, you can run into a lot of permissions and shoot yourself in the foot. Dodge the bullet. Keep it default. After we've gone through and set up our storage, we're going to go into the networking. Now, this is where I will have a word of warning if you want to go through and do a bridge or not to bridge. If you're doing this on a laptop, you don't want to bridge because you're going to be roaming from one network to another network, and you may not have a static IP. If this is going to be a standalone home machine that's going to be in the back corner, I would go through and plug in that Ethernet and then absolutely do a bridge. Because then you can go through and make sure anything that you're running inside of virtual machines can then talk to the rest of your network. We can also talk about how to segment your homes and segment LANs and separate networks. I go into that in my YouTube channel. That's something I can geek out about for hours, so I'm not going to bore you with that. We'll just say, let's go with default. All right, so how to go through and set up that bridge is that very simple button that's right here. It says, add it, add the bridge. Then it's going to say, hey, what's the name of the bridge? Go with default, which is just bridge 0. And then you're going to select your 2 ports. Your Ethernet name may be different here because, Linux is fun. We like to rename our network adapters all the time and not keep things simple. Then we're going to also pair it to the virtualization network that's installed by default when you install the virtual machine software. Then we click the apply button, and we are off and running to the races because now we have our network bridge. With those two prerequisites out of the way, let's set up our first virtual machine, or KVM. I try to blow up the text here because the terminal, there's too much information. If you go through and you install this libguest package, you can go through and see a lot of pre-made machines that you're able to then issue a command line and download. CentOS, Ubuntu, Kali Linux, you name it, somebody has made an image out there already for you in the QCOW2 format. Now, if you're not familiar with QCOW2, it's very similar to when you're working with VMware or other VirtualBox. You have like VBox for VirtualBox. You have VDIs for VMware. QCOW2 is the one set up for KVM. So it's a different extension, same idea. So you can go through and do the Virt Builder list and actually see all of the different ones that you can download by default. If we move over and say, if I want to download this and implement this immediately, doing a command line, you can go sudo virt builder, the name of the build that you currently see, and then the TAC-O is the name that you're going to give it. In this case, I was setting up an rsyslog server, so I gave it that name. I said format QCOW2, and then I'm going to add additional information to it. So this TAC, or the two negative signs update, is saying here's the additional things. I want the host name to be rsyslog1. Set this root password, and this is not the real root password, but we want to make sure that we're setting good examples, so a long, more secure password is better. And then I set the size to 20 gigabytes. There are a lot more commands that you can go through and add here. If you type in man, M-A-N, space virt builder, you'll have an entire list of those different things that you can do and customize it. But this will get you started. So those are the pre-made images. What if you wanted to install and run another RHEL KVM box? Well, that same place that we went through and downloaded the ISO, you can scroll down the page a little bit more, and there is the QCOW2 image. So while this says the DVD, that's super small. There we go. It says KVM guest. If you look for the KVM guest, there's also going to be an updated date underneath there, so it tells you what the most current version is. In my use case, when I used to work with the DoD, I had to make sure I had the same version implemented, so I had to go back a version and make sure I had that KVM downloaded. If I want the latest, just look for the date, grab that QCOW2 image, and download it. The benefits of the KVM image, or the QCOW2, is that it is so much smaller than that DVD ISO. So the DVD for RHEL 9 was what, almost 9 gigabytes? Your RHEL KVM image is 900 megabytes. So it's a lot smaller, it will download a lot faster, and you can use those again and again. So you can do that with RHEL 8, you can do that with RHEL 9. If you need to get older ones, you can do that as well. Same step process. When we talked about making sure that you are putting these images and setting up that storage, if you download it just the way that I told you to, it's just going to download to your home folder. You want to then move those files over to /lib/libvirt, var lib/libvirt, and that's where you're going to go through and move those images to, so then the permissions are set up correctly. It knows to see that information both in Cockpit, if you have Virtual Machine Manager installed, etc. So that's the process of making sure that you move them to the right directory. And then this very bottom one, it's a very long list, but this is the install example of using the Red Hat KVM. So we're saying here's TAC-A, the name of the file that we're going to go through and use. We're updating the root password, so 2020 make good passwords. And then in this case, the KVM images that are on the Red Hat site are also built for you to be able to implement and use on different cloud instances. So it has Cloud Init installed. That's great for some people. If you want to be able to just push that up to Amazon to Azure or whatever else. The Cloud Init package goes through and defines, I want to get a dynamic address for IP. There are other things that each one of those cloud providers push that Cloud Init interacts with. Since we're just using this on our local box, we don't need Cloud Init installed. I'm going through and setting up things with a static IP address. So I'll make sure to uninstall Cloud Init. All right, so importing on images is fairly simple. We're out of the command line, back to the GUI again. In the top right-hand corner, there is a import VM. And in this case, you've got options of, this is the window that pops up. You can give it a name. You can say, is this going to be a system or a session? And then the path to wherever you had that KVM. Then from there, you can set your RAM limits here. And this is always reconfigurable after the point as well, but this is what is there by default. And you can click that accept button. By default, VMs are going to do private networking when you start it up. If we just click that yes button, it's going to automatically spin things up. It'll start booting in. And there is a network of like 192.168.100.x or 122.x that it sets up a private network to where it's just the network on your individual machine. We set up the binding earlier, but we need to make sure to set that inside of the VM. So to do that, we go through and click the networking side, go into edit, and we're going to do the drop-down menu for source, and we're going to make it that bridge. Oop, there we go. We're going to set it to bridge. So instead of it being on the private network now, we're going to have it to where it can talk to the rest of our network. And at that point, you now have, within about 30 minutes or so, a box installed, your virtualization software installed as well. You've got 1 or 2 VMs running, and now the world's your oyster, right? So if you want to be able to set up a home lab, you can have up to, like I said, 16 of those RHEL developer boxes installed. You can have Rocky, Alma, a Kali Linux box, right? Whatever you want, it's able to go through and be done there. So with that, I know that we're getting close on our time. There are a few hardware suggestions. I am a hardware nerd and can talk about this for hours ad nauseum. And if I'm talking about spending your money versus spending my money, hey, you might want to be able to say, what makes sense here? I like to go through and say, if you're a student, if you're just trying to get into this, or you have very little money, here are some suggestions to get started. If you're going to build a machine or try to buy a machine, don't go with anything with less than 4 cores nowadays, because there are so many pieces of software out there, or if you're just installing like 2 VMs, you're going to max out your machine. If you can get more cores, that's going to be better off. If you start looking into, hey, I want to run like OpenShift, single node installer, that is really heavy. You need 8 virtual CPUs. And a virtual CPU in this case is actually a thread. So right now, on one side of the house, I say, let's just do 4 cores. Some cheap devices only have 4 cores and 4 threads, and they don't have the option to turn on virtualization. Some do. So if you got a NUC with 4 cores, make sure that you're getting one that can also do the hyper-threading as well. Otherwise, you can have a very cool little box that's not going to meet your needs. So moving right along, on server sizes, man, you can go a whole slew of different ones. You got your small form factors, you got your teeny meeny micro, the 1 liter side. You can build yourself an inexpensive tower as well. And it's tempting because, you know, there's so many people selling those rackable systems, or pizza boxes as some people call them. On the machine sizes for the tiny, midi, small stuff, if you have a small space, or if you don't want it to be eating a bunch of energy, your smaller stuff is a good option. You can get these used off of eBay fairly inexpensively. You can get them used off of Amazon fairly inexpensively. These HP T630s I picked up on eBay for 25 bucks a pop. Me loving Raspberry Pis, I was spending more on Raspberry Pis than I was buying a complete box. So your mileage may vary there. This has got the 4 cores. I can do up to 32 gigs of RAM in it. And if you watch eBay, this is a good option. You have expandability too, which is the fun part. You've actually got DDR3 RAM slots you can upgrade. You've got mSATA drives. So this is an option that's a little bit older, but still works just fine. In fact, that's running a couple of different pieces of software for our hackerspace. The next box was like an HP EliteDesk 705. I picked this up for used on Amazon for about 150 bucks and then upgraded to a 1 terabyte hard drive. So I was all in about $200 and you've got yourself a good little virtualization box. The benefit of this one is that you had both the NVMe drive here, so that's super fast read-write speed, and you had a full 2.5 inch. Yes?
For those machines that can't run Windows 11, because Windows 10 end of life is October 24, these are coming down in price every month.
Absolutely. So an audience member just went through and said because Windows 11 is now forcing a lot of hardware upgrades, there's certain hardware that's not supported by Windows 11. So Windows 10 boxes are getting shuffled off, and these guys will run Linux just beautifully, so you can forget that Windows side of the house, and the prices are dropping rapidly because it doesn't support Windows 11. I picked up an Intel NUC 10th gen, and that was because at the time I had some expendable money. It was expensive, but it is a very small footprint. I will say bang for buck, you've got better options, but if you're looking for a small package and a very low power, a NUC is a good investment. But it's going to set you back about 600 bucks. In this small form factor versus building yourself a full tower, you have a lot more expandability in a full tower. Question? Yes, absolutely. The point was made that you can do up to 64 gigs in these, no problem. That is an interesting thing as well because a lot of the hardware nowadays, if you're going with the AMD or Ryzen side of the house, all the way up, I believe, into the 5th gen, they would only do up to 64 gig. Now, after that, you can do up to 128 gig. That's great when you're looking at doing that comparison with RAM compared to your servers, rack-mountable servers. They can do hundreds of gigabytes at the trade-off of sucking your power bill dry and your pocketbook as well. So also on the Intel NUC, you've got 2 RAM slots as well, NVMe 2-inch drive, and there's your slew of different footprint sizes for each one of these. Towers, I'm a big fan of building towers because you've got the ability to upgrade. You can get a fairly inexpensive box for about 600 bucks. This is my build that I did in 2020. I have got 3 new builds that I'm linking on my blog to say, talking with the wife, talking about budgeting, finding out how we're going to go through and upgrade the lab. Because I do this all the time. About a 3 to 5 year time frame to update hardware is a good rule of thumb. And the power that you can get now is incredible. You can build yourself a 6-core or an 8-core or a 12-core box for $6, $8, or $1,000. And even up to a few years ago, you couldn't do that much power for the bang for buck. So that's a good option there. Rack-mountable servers, I have quite a few. This one is an example. Cool RAM, everything's neat. You've got your iDRAC system or being able to do it out of band management. It sits and eats 200 watts of power just turning on. I didn't like paying that bill, so I bought myself an Intel NUC that sits at 19 under full load. So your mileage is going to vary there. Just because the hardware is cheap doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. So in my opinion, if you want the best form factor, go with the small ones. If you want upgradability, go with the heart. Make yourself a tower. I don't see a very good reason to buy the rackable systems at this point in time because the hardware is older and your power is much, much lower. If you're getting it for free and you can put it into a colo for free, go for it. It's free hardware. Otherwise, I wouldn't go through and invest in that. I know that we're up to our 2 minutes time, so I'm going to quickly run through a couple of resources that you can go through and use to deep dive. And apparently I made the text way too small here, or the font's wrong. If you're looking for hardware on a different Linux device, I'm really liking the Level 1 Tech channel because Wendell goes super deep on hardware. He's constantly like, hey, this is running well on Linux, this is not running well on Linux. A couple of my latest builds, I've gone off of his recommendations, so awesome there. If you're looking more into the Kubernetes and building that side of the house, Techno Tim is a fairly newer YouTuber, but fantastic information to share there. If you're into Raspberry Pis and Ansible, if you don't know about Jeff Gerling, you should. That man has made me spend so much more money in saying, oh, we can do this too. But it's fantastic content. If you're looking on the more MSP side of the house, or you want to be able to set up your house more as an enterprise, if you're running a hackerspace, if you want to help your church out with IT, volunteering is great with that. Lawrence Lab Systems has got some fantastic tutorials on everything open source, on different hardware. In fact, it was his channel that turned me on to the whole Draw.io network mapping thing. So totally worth the subscription there. If you're new to Linux and you want to get into a couple different podcasts for Linux, the Linux Gamecast has been going for a very long time. It's not necessarily safe for work, but it is a fun listen. As we're both a Tux Digital with Destination Linux, family friendly, you're good to go. And the Linux Unplugged is also a good third option. If you're looking for more RHEL content, you can go check out the Red Hat Enterprise Linux channel. They are doing a fantastic job of uploading things like if you're going through your R8CSA and you're looking at those chapter names, they've got a video on each one of those, and they deep dive as well. So if you catch them live, you can interact with them as well. It's a good small group of folks that are like 5 streamers that they swap between back and forth with each other. If you're already using Red Hat and you're the hands-on individual, you're the sysadmin, you're constantly testing things, go check out the Red Hat Accelerators. That is an awesome group because you're able to actually sign up and see things that are coming to Red Hat and to our customers 6 weeks, 10 weeks ahead of time and get your feedback. It's a fairly unique opportunity. There is a screening process to go through and do it because we want to make sure it's a good community fit. We have people who are very vocal about the pros and cons, which is what we want to have happen, but we want to make sure that you're actually working with RHEL or any of our other products on a daily basis. With that, are there any questions? You know what? Absolutely. That was the exact next slide there is if you want to be able to see this content, if you want to be able to check out the YouTube channel or follow me on Twitter. I'm getting on the other social medias as well. Some of them I've been a little bit more paranoid about, but you can find everything there on my GitHub page, and it goes from there. We had another question. Ooh, what's the benefits of doing Cockpit versus Proxmox? If you have installed Proxmox before, or if you are familiar with ESXi, you're probably not a beginner to Linux. So I was looking for, what is the super basic, I've got one machine, I've got 20 minutes, can I set up a box? I have installed Proxmox before, and it's Debian-based. You can install KVM images, so the same step process that you did here with the QCOW2 images, you can absolutely do on the Proxmox side. So it depends on your scale, is what I would say. If you've got heavier hardware, you want to be able to do clustering, Proxmox is a good option. If you just have a single box that you want sitting in the corner, Cockpit's an easy way to get started. You betcha. We had another, and I'll go to you next. So when I go through, the question was, how are you managing the subscription status of the guest VMs? You can either do that via the command line, or we can do the same step process by registering that up, just like we did with our initial host box. So because there are different ways to subscribe your VMs, same thing that we did is the basic by going through and just registering that via the GUI that you can go through in the VM. If you're just command line only, then I can go through and make sure to put a link to the string or a drop-down menu of here's X, Y, and Z of how to subscribe your VMs to Red Hat subscription. So that was a great question.
Yeah. Could I do virtualization on virtualization? What I mean is, could I install RHEL 9 on, say, under ESXi and then install Bluebird on that and run virtual machines on virtual hosts?
So the question was, can you do virtualization inside of virtual being inception-wise? So ESXi as the host OS, then RHEL as the guest OS, and then something else underneath it. You can. There's no reason why you couldn't, except that it might get a little bit slower when you start going down that infinite abyss of, okay, I can virtualize to infinity. So yes, you can. You absolutely can. Okay, and then you had a question.
Yeah, my question was under one host VM or a bare metal host, you can have up to 16.
Yes. So the question was, underneath your host machine, you can have up to 16 machines, and the answer would be you have 16 subscriptions to be able to use with Red Hat, period, per email address. So it would actually be one for the host, then you could do 15 underneath that. Or if you needed to then start subscribing to a different email, if you needed to go larger than that, I will say for home labs, 16 numbers have been a good number for me. When I look at like installing more of the security side of the house, so like you want to use a Tenable, you want to get that up and running at home, they can only do 16 or 32 licenses. So I like to segment my home network, which is a little bit crazy, IoT networks and such, to where I'll have a test network of 16 machines. And then if I need a secondary test network, I'll do another 16 machines. But it'll be with a different email address and go from there. Yes, another question.
So when you have to register a VM,
Yes.
if you want to change the VM and do something else, you have to deregister.
Okay, so the question was, if you wanted to destroy the VM, do you have to deregister? And the answer to your question is yes. You can do that two different ways. You can either do that in the command line or in a GUI, or if you just log back into the access.redhat.com, go to that subscription button there at the top, it'll have the list and the host names of your machines. This is why it's important to put a host name, because if you just have localhost, 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 well, which localhost am I going to delete off of my list? Versus if you name them, you're going to be able to say, oh, Fire Squirrel. Fire Squirrel is the one I want to take away, versus, I don't know, Fire Squirrel was the first thing off the top of my head. Your other machines that you could go through and, Ice Monkey, there you go, thank you. So Ice Monkey versus Fire Squirrel. So yes, you can uninstall it or unregister it a couple different ways. You betcha. Yes. Do you have to re-register your subscription after a period of time? And the answer is yes, it's after 1 year. They have gotten a lot faster by turning around. You can't pre-register for another year. You got to get to that year point and then say, oh, I want to re-register. And then it literally takes minutes, and you're back re-registered again, and you're good to go. Is there a grace period on the registration? You can infinitely re-register year over year over year. We're keeping that. Go ahead.
Sorry, if you said you have to wait until the full year.
Yes, so if you're paying for a Red Hat Linux subscription, you could prepay to make sure there is no gap. But when this is the free developer license, just to make things simple on us, we said, here's the 1 year mark. After the 1 year mark, you can go back in that same day, click re-register, and you're good to go. So there's no pre-registration for the free developer license.
Does that transition break your VM?
It has not broken my VMs in testing. So I'm consistently trying to test for that to make sure that's not going to be an issue in the future. There may be a break in that, but with 16, hopefully that's going to be easier. I usually go through and also set up a Ansible playbook to where I can register things easier versus just doing GUI. So unregistering and re-registering just with the same account information, I can have examples of that on my GitHub as well. Hopefully that answered your question.
I was wondering about a grace period. Is it something like 5 days, 6 days, or is that at the end of 1 year, you're not registered?
It is at the end of 1 year, you're not registered. So. That it does not break it doesn't lock the machine, it just means that you can't get the newest patches and updates. So as soon as you re-register, you're good to go. So no breakage. And then I had somebody in the back, and then I'll go to you next.
I was just curious, are you getting notifications of your anniversary date?
That's a great question. I didn't check for that. I'm seeing a couple people shaking their heads no. I can go through and see if we can't go and make an exception for that, or try to make that as an RFE, so we can have that as a future.
My notification is, hey, your updates don't work.
Your updates don't work? Yeah, that would be a good indicator. And then we had one here.
Yeah, looking around at Linux jobs, there's a lot of places that are using Red Hat. So once you have this set up as a home level, what can you do with it to show your skills to these employers?
So the question was, once you have this up and running in your home lab and you're seeing RHEL sysadmin jobs out there, how can you prove you're doing something in your home lab that would be applicable to what they're doing in the office? Here's the fun part. Everybody does it differently. And that sounds like a generic cast-off, but it's not. Because what I would suggest you go through and do, the slides for success that I went through and had a little bit earlier, just a couple slides, by going through and, boop, this one, dot, 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 dot. I always saw this and proving whether you had a blog, whether you had videos, that you're doing this. These are the generic tasks that every single employer is going to need. So if you can make sure you've got a documented process, here's how I built my home lab, it's on my blog. Oh, here's my network diagram of my home lab. These are virtually checking off boxes in their head saying that you're hireable, you're documenting, you know your stuff, even if you're just doing it in your home lab. And that's what ended up helping me land the job, because between networking and then showing the documentation, whether it was good, whether it was bad, found out that they didn't have any when I started mine. Thereafter, it's like, okay, as part of the interning or the interview process, hey, what does your network look like at this point? Me asking the employer, saying, oh, yeah, okay, you might want to start dodging, or it's just going to be a great learning experience, one of the two. Hopefully that answers your question. We had one more in the back. Ooh. Okay. Fantastic question. To repeat for the stream would be, since Cockpit has so many different things inside of it, do you recommend using all of them? i.e., as an example, using containerization with Podman underneath Cockpit. And if you don't, and this is going to be a generic Linux thing, if you don't need a service, don't install it. If you want that service, go for it. For getting your feet wet, I like going through and using Podman, especially introducing folks to Linux. It's a clean interface that you can get yourself up and running. Do I use every single module inside of Cockpit? And the answer is no. There are some boxes that you can install performance PCP, and I'm trying to remember the acronym, or what the full name is, not the acronym, but it's a performance pack that you can go through and monitor just the living crap out of all of your hardware, but it's a little bit heavy. You may not need to install that on everything. You may not need to install that on your Raspberry Pi, but maybe your Iron or your tower you can install PCP on. There are other additional like storage modules you can go through and install inside of Cockpit as well. So if you're not running a storage server, it may not be necessary. So installing everything, no, but you have that ability using Cockpit. And hopefully that answers your question. All right. One last one, and then we'll get out of here.
Under the dev license, are there other products available?
Ooh. All right, the question was, underneath the developer license, are there other products that you can go through and try with the free Red Hat developer license? And the answer is yes. You can go through and install, I've seen Ansible Automation Platform, AAP. I've seen OpenShift. You can install up to 60 days as a trial there as well. And again, in those situations, you can install that trial, run it for that long, delete it, reinstall it, and then be able to continue going from there. So we're not going to suggest that you're running this in production, but if this is a home lab, it's meant to stand up, have it up and running long enough for you to actually try and get used to it and learn it, and then go from there. Right? Thank you so much for coming to my talk.